This is John Harcher, and welcome to episode 11 of Valleys of Numenor. In this episode, we'll take another look at the chronology of Conan the Barbarian, but come at it from a different angle than last time, using information the duo from the 30s could possibly have known about. But we've got it. Episode 11. Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, Construction of a Chronology, Part 2. Fragments, synopses, and drafts. Oh my! The chronology of the stories of everyone's favorite barbarian, sketched out by P. Schuyler Miller and John Clark, would have worked just fine had it not been for the discovery of a load of Conan-related material in Robert E. Howard's papers by L. Sprague de Camp and the author's agent Glenn Lord. These included completed unpublished stories, various drafts of the published and unpublished work, fragments of stories never finished, and synopses to stories written and unwritten. Putting these into a coherent timeline proved problematic, to be sure. De Camp's solution was simply write out any inconsistencies and make things fit. But our task is to take what Howard wrote and see how it fits together as written. Some of the quote-unquote inconsistencies came from the fact that several of the stories were rejected or unfinished. Howard then took some ideas from that work and used it in a story that did get published, causing two descriptions of the same event. We now have far more information at our fingertips than Miller or Clark, let alone Robert E. Howard, could have ever imagined. To piece the puzzle together, not only should we look at the stories themselves, but also the order they were written and what story, if any, did an unpublished work get replaced by. This may give us an insight into what Howard was looking for to tell the tale of his barbarian hero. What path did he intend on setting him on, and why did one idea win out over another? I'll use the Miller-Clark chronology as a framework and tackle the stories and other material in the order Howard wrote them to see if they fit in easily, or if there is enough of a conflict to warrant a change of position. Thanks again to Patrice Lunier's Hyborian Genesis essays for the roadmap, and Joe Marek, Dale Ripke, and Armor the Lion for their chronological work. I'll bring them up from time to time to see where we match and where we may differ. Conan the Barbarian arguably arose from a mixture of three sources. A, the unpublished Cull story By This Axe I Rule, written in 1929. B, the poem Chimeria, written in February 1932. And C, a Gaelic character named Conan that appeared in the 1931 story People of the Dark. By This Axe I Rule became Phoenix on the Sword with its new hero, Conan the Cimmerian, king of Aquilonia. In several paragraphs of the first draft, Howard sketched out the beginnings of what would become the Hyborian Age. He sent that draft to his frequent publisher Weird Tales, but it was returned. However, editor Farnsworth Wright gave him a few ideas on how to improve it. Howard did so, creating the famous introduction, The Numidian Chronicles, and Wright accepted it for publication. At the same time, he returned another story Howard wrote featuring Conan called The Frost Giant's Daughter. A year later, in much the same way he'd rewritten a Cull story into a Conan story, he changed the hero to another character named Amra of Akbatana, and as we mentioned last time, had it published in a small fan magazine renamed as Gods of the North. De Camp discovered the Conan version in the early 50s, did some of his own rewriting on it, and had it published in 1953. The unedited version wasn't published until the late 80s in Carl Edward Wagner's Echoes of Valor series. At one point in the foreword to one of the Berkeley editions of the Conan stories, Wagner argued Gods of the North was the original story, but it doesn't appear that was the case once some additional research was done. So for purposes of placement, where does the Frost Giant's Daughter go? De Camp placed it after Queen of the Black Coast. There doesn't seem to be any real reason to place it at this point in Conan's career other than the Aesir helmet he wears. However, the rewritten version contains a paragraph describing Amra's travels as he confronts Atalai. He's traveled the Hyborian world far and wide, so it would make sense it taking place after he's had some adventures. Plus, remember, Amra was Conan's nickname, and Akbatana is a city in the south. So maybe it could be reconciled that this actually is Conan, just under an alias. And it's a stretch, I know, but if you had to reason its placement, this seems to be an inventive explanation. The addition of the Hyborian lands in reference to Amra may have been a sly dig at Farnsworth for not accepting the story. But as we said last time, that's not the version that officially features Conan. The first version was written immediately after Phoenix on the Sword, so it could be assumed that that's the next story Howard wanted to tell about the character. It is interesting that Howard mentions Conan traveling north after the sacking of Venarium in the Miller letter. All those years later, it looks like he still considered this unpublished story to be canon. Conan seems to be a young man in his boastfulness against Heimdall the Vanir warrior and in the fact that Adalai chooses him for a victim. Considering Howard says in the letter that Conan went north before he came to Zamora, it's likely this story can be placed first in the chronology. The next story Howard wrote was also rejected by Wright and was unpublished until DeCamp put out an edited, rewritten version in 1952. The God in the Bowl took place in Media, a kingdom named in Phoenix on the Sword. It has Conan being a somewhat unsuccessful thief, being played for a fool by a noble, and then must confront a killer demon. So it takes place during the thief era, that's for sure. The question is, should it be placed before or after Tower of the Elephant? He seems to be less experienced in this story than in Tower. Some of the reasoning for its previous placements was the direction Conan was traveling. If we were to use that as a guide, is it possible to find a way to get him from Hyperborea in the north, where Howard said Conan was a captive after Frost Giant's daughter, to Zamora and Tower of the Elephant? On Howard's own Hyborian Age map, Hyperborea shares its largest southern border with Brythunia. Directly south of that is Nemedia. So if Conan headed straight south, he would have ended up in Nemalia, the city mentioned in God in the Bowl. It's probably a bit much to think Conan took part in the raid on Venarium, traveled north to battle the Aesir, got captured by the Hyperboreans, headed 2 countries south, and then went 2 countries east to Zamora, all in the space of the year Howard noted in the letter. I suppose he'd put God in the Bowl out of his mind as the story of Conan's early days as a thief, since he'd published that story as Tower of the Elephant. Judging by the way the barbarian acts in each story, it generally supports placing God before Tower. At this point, Howard had so many ideas about this new age he created zipping around in his head that he decided to write out a history of this lost era called the Hyborian Age. It ended up linking the Conan series with his earlier Kull series, as well as some other tales later on. As tied in as it is to the Conan series, it almost always appears alongside of them in complete collections. But I'm going to talk about it next month with that episode, since we'll be dealing with the way Howard linked a lot of his characters and stories together. These links also support looking at the stories to see if there are any hints along the way of where to place them. To paraphrase Neil Young, it's all one story. The next tale written was the aforementioned Tower of the Elephant. It arose out of the ashes of a synopsis he put together for a story where Conan was chased by the Zamoran army and ends up paired with a mercenary to loot an abandoned city. This was discovered in the 60s among Howard's papers, and numerous people, Elsrod de Camp, Roy Thomas, Mike Mignola, have taken a shot at crafting a story out of the events listed in it. It's come to be known most familiarly as Hall of the Dead, owing to the location of the main event that happens towards the story's conclusion. Howard, though, gave up on making a story out of this outline, but used the idea of Conan as a thief in Zamora to help create Tower of the Elephant. The events of this synopsis can easily be placed after the published story. Howard wrote Scarlet Citadel next, and its placement after Phoenix is not in doubt. Queen of the Black Coast followed, presumably inspired by Conan's confrontation with Bombi's king and his time as Amra, sailing the southern coast in a dragon-proud ship. Interestingly, Howard refers to Baelit's ship as serpent-like several times, but never comes right out and says the ship has a dragon on its prow. Nor does anyone refer to Conan directly as Amra, but he's described as having the wrath of a wounded lion. As I mentioned last episode, there does seem to be some ambiguity as to whether the next story, Black Colossus, should be placed before or after Queen of the Black Coast. To me, the deciding factor was something Miller or Clark had no way of knowing: the order in which Howard wrote the stories. Conan's history of a thief is mentioned when he meets one of his former compatriots out in the desert, but never to his time as a pirate. Wouldn't it scare the daylights more out of his fellow mercenaries knowing they've got a former Black Coast pirate, possibly Amra the Lion, in their midst? Even more compelling to me is that Conan is a well-equipped mercenary at the start of Queen of the Black Coast looking for employment. Much as mentioning his time as a pirate in Scarlet Citadel may have led to Queen, his mercenary garb in that story might have led to Black Colossus. Also, the fact that in Queen of the Black Coast, Conan had already traveled to many lands, so having at least one story in between his thief days and Queen of the Black Coast would make sense. This was also the argument I made if you tried to fit Gods of the North into the Miller-Clark chronology after Queen. A flip with Black Colossus would make sense. Now comes, in my opinion, the single most difficult story to pin down in terms of exact chronology: Iron Shadows in the Moon, which was published under the slightly altered title Shadows in the Moonlight. The original chronology had it in the order the stories were written without them knowing it: Queen of the Black Coast, Black Colossus, Iron Shadows, and the Moon. Dale Ripke surmises an order where they were essentially written in reverse, namely Iron Shadows first, then Black Colossus, then Queen of the Black Coast. Amra's chronology has Iron Shadows placed way after Black Colossus and Queen of the Black Coast. Even though the story was written after Queen, Conan makes no mention of his time along the Black Coast. Dale Ripke uses this as part of his conclusion the story took place before the other two. Also, part of his calculation is that Conan knows how to shoot a bow while on a ship, an art he learned among the Hyrcanians, and there's no other story that has him in that part of the world. But also in Queen, Conan mentions he saw an ape once in a Hyrcanian city, and it was a sad creature. That certainly does not describe the beast he battles at the end of this story. Conan also seems far more at ease at sea than he does in Queen. For mainly that reason, I come down supporting a later placement. The next story also had its name changed for Weird Tales. If it hadn't, it's likely Miller and Clark may not have made their one definite mistake. The story was called The Slithering Shadow in the magazine, but when Howard submitted it, he did so under the title Zuthal of the Dusk. And as we've mentioned many times, the two missed the reference to Zuthal in The Devil in Iron, but it's less likely they would have had it been in the title of the story. As far as its placement, Amra continued his radical rethinking by having this placed before Iron Shadows, where everyone else had it placed somewhere after. The crux of the matter dealt with the rebel prince of Koth. He's unnamed in Iron Shadows, but called Almuric in Zuthal. Ripke thinks it's likely the two characters are the same. Amra thinks the two are brothers. Either way, it would likely have been a totally down on his luck Conan to go side with a rebel prince again after he'd been sold out and almost wiped out in Iron Shadows, or just almost wiped out in Zuthal. He must really hate that king. For Howard to have written two stories in a row about rebel princes and to have the second end so destructively, it must follow the first one. Pool of the Black One is next, and it's definitely set long after Conan's days as a corsair on the southern coast. Being a Baroccan pirate seems to be a different subset of Hyborian Age ocean-going thievery. Rogues in the House follow. For the first time, Howard went directly back to Conan's days as a thief. The writer himself wasn't exactly sure where the story took place, figuring it happened in one of the city-states along the Zamoran border. It also mentions Conan's hanged partner at the beginning of the story as a Gunderman deserter from the mercenaries. In the Hall of the Dead synopsis, the character of Nestor was described as a Gunderman mercenary. And by the end of the synopsis, it looked like he deserted, having gained treasure from the city and slashing his way away from the guards who come to arrest him. Sounds like the same character. So from that unused synopsis to a story never written, Howard created both the story that came before it, Tower of the Elephant, and the one that came after it, Rogues in the House. This bit of artistic creation helps me argue against placing God in the Bowl anywhere in between this trio. Some argue for placing it after Rogues in the House, but by the end of Rogues, Conan has learned far too much about the machinations of civilized people to be fooled by the likes of Astræus Botanius. Veil of Lost Women was written next, and lost is a good word for it. It was the last completed Conan tale to be discovered in the mid-60s. There doesn't seem to be any record of it being submitted anywhere. With Conan being somewhere in the southern kingdoms, the most likely placement would be right after Queen of the Black Coast. The camp thought so and placed it there. But this seems to be a more world-weary Conan and a far more calculating one. In fact, he acts a lot like he does in Pool of the Black One, especially the way he dispatches a rival after working in concert with him. Could this possibly be placed later on? Maybe, but for now, we can slot it in after Queen of the Black Coast. Until we reach the next group of writings, that is. From all evidence, it looks like Howard made a couple of attempts to start a new Conan story before taking a break from the character for a few months. One of them is a fragment of a couple of pages. The first page has Conan, though never named, just called a Cimmerian, being the lone survivor of a battle and his discovery of another survivor, a girl in a trunk by a river. The next page describes the fear in the people of Yarralet every night and what two people, the priest Italis and Prince Than, will do about it. That's it. That's all we have to work with. It's almost as if it's a false start to Iron Shadows. It certainly appears this is Conan during his early mercenary period, since he barely has anything more than a sword to use. In fact, this may be his very first mercenary job. After its discovery, Lynn Carter finished it and called it The Hand of Nergal after a talisman he created for the story. Everyone puts this episode directly after Rogues in the House, or soon after in one case. The main question that popped up is the location of Yarralet. Carter had it somewhere in or near Turan, and Conan being with their army at this point. But Howard specifically mentions in Black Colossus Conan spent time as a mercenary with the Corinthian army. If Yarralet is anywhere, it's likely somewhere near Corinthia, so placing this fragment in between Rogues in the House and Black Colossus could work. Howard mentions in the Miller letter that Conan returns to Cimmeria at this point, after Rogues, but there's no reason he could not go back and then return and try his hand at another vocation. The other unfinished piece consists of a synopsis and several chapters. DeCamp and Carter finished the story, basically following the synopsis, and called it Snout in the Dark. It takes place in the capital of Kush, and Conan describes himself as recently having been a corsair and dressed in armor with a red cloak. Sounds like his outfit and occupation in Queen of the Black Coast, except for the fact he burned his cloak with Bailey. So this can clearly be placed in the aftermath of Queen of the Black Coast. But don't we have Veil of Lost Women in that slot? This fragment and synopsis fits far better into the space after Queen, so let's take out Veil, put it aside for now, since pushing it down to the next slot doesn't fit very well either. Later in 1933, Howard began to write Conan stories again, coming up with The Devil in Iron First. Conan is again a Kozaki, but this time he's a leader, and the King of Turan's name is different from the one in Iron Shadows, so it's later than that. And I've beaten to death the point about the Zuthal reference, so let's place this right after that story. He then wrote his longest tale of the Cimmerian to date, People of the Black Circle. It takes place even further east than Devil in Iron and follows up on that story closely, so it makes sense to place it next in line. Howard's next endeavor was writing a novel. He made 3 attempts. 2 were Conan stories, and 1 turned into the sci-fi novel Almanac. The first attempt at a Conan novel dealt with him as a secondary character for a portion of the time. It's assumed Howard abandoned it when it became clear there simply was not enough material to create a novel. It was among the papers discovered in the 60s and completed by Elsbrag de Camp with the title Drums of Tombaku. It takes place in the southern kingdoms after Conan and his fellow soldier Amalric get lost after another war involving Koth and Stygia goes bad. Boy, Conan really has it out for Koth, doesn't he? The Cimmerian even mentions he'd been in this part of the world before. That means this story needs to be placed after Zuthal, but since Devil and Iron and People of the Black Circle are there, Tombalku can safely be placed after them since it neither contradicts or conflicts with anything in those stories. And thanks to that, we now have a placement for Vale of Lost Women since Conan is in that part of the world. We also have an added piece to it of his being disillusioned after a situation going horribly wrong, namely the Tombalkan Civil War. Some have argued he could have been disillusioned after Baelit's death, but the presence of the Snout in the Dark material makes this placement for Vale an easier fit. Finally, Howard did complete his novel, a Conan story named Hour of the Dragon. It later became the first Conan story to get widespread attention when it came out in paperback and renamed Conan the Conqueror. It also gives more information about Conan's youth. In the letter to Miller, Howard confirms this story takes place 4 or 5 years after Conan became king, placing it last in the chronology. He also mentioned in the letter that several other things happened during his reign, but unfortunately none of those ever made it into story form. After a short break, Howard wrote A Witch Shall Be Born, containing the famous sequence where Conan, nailed to a cross, breaks the neck of a vulture with his teeth. Miller Clark has it placed after Iron Shadows, Ripke placed it after Zuthal, and Amra placed it after Black Colossus. I find it hard to imagine Conan would go directly from being general of the Karajan army to captain of the guard in neighboring Koran, so I think it has to be later than that. Dale Ripke brought up the point about how many times massive armies are raised, namely how many 30,000-man armies are laying around to pop up a few months apart. That helped his explanation in placing Zuthal and Tombalku further apart. I think the same principle can work here in a roundabout way to have it basically fit where Miller and Clark had it. There does need to be some time between Iron Shadows and Zuthal to go from peace and Koth to things going bad once more, whether it's the same prince or another. So by placing this story in between those two, since this one takes place over several months, it allows time for other events to happen. The next story, known as Servants of Bit Yakin, Howard's title, or Jewels of Gwalar, Wright's title, forgot to mention he changed that last time, has Conan as a general in the southern kingdom of Kishan when he heads deep into the jungle to find a lost city and rare jewels. Howard describes Conan as being late of the Baraka Isles. Judging by the use of a description like that, he typically does it to refer when a story takes place. So it would mean this should be placed directly after Pool and the Black One, since it takes place around the Baraka Isles. Amra's chronology actually has the story before Pool, saying that just because it says Conan was late at the Baraka Isles doesn't mean it has to follow that story that had him there. I mean, it's possible. I think it just makes more sense to have it come after. Howard decided to try something radical for his next work featuring Conan. First off, the barbarian would not be the main character. In fact, he wouldn't appear in it at all. He would only be mentioned in reference to his battle for the throne of Aquilonia. Second, the setting would be based on the Revolutionary War stories of Robert W. Chambers rather than the Middle Eastern or medieval-ish settings of the other Hyborian Age stories. And the main enemies would be the Picts, part of Howard's practically lifelong interest with the lost people. Much like the earlier attempt to write a tale with Conan as a secondary character, Wolves Beyond the Border ended up unfinished. But once again, Howard had given himself an idea that he was able to successfully turn into a full story. In the drafts, a character mentioned that either 5 or 10 years earlier, depending on which draft you read, Conan fought the Picts in a battle long remembered by the people of the wilderness. Howard then wrote a novella about that fight. Beyond the Black River stands out among the Conan stories as not the usual sword and sorcery epic. It felt more down to earth because it was. There was a demonic sorcerer hidden in the woods in the story, but the main enemies are the Picts, and they are a force more dangerous than any wizard. It proved to be one of the best examples of Howard's philosophy of civilization versus barbarism. It also seemed to have an obvious placement since Conan was in the Aquilonian army before he became king, and that's where he is in this story. So it can be slotted in before Phoenix on the Sword. Now, once again, everything would have worked just fine had L. Sprague de Camp not discovered the third of three completed tales in Howard's papers. The Black Stranger was written directly after Beyond the Black River and is also a direct sequel to it. It's also mainly about pirates who confront a supernatural menace at the end of the story. Sounds a little like Pool the Black One. I guess Weird Tales felt like it covered that ground already, so it didn't appear there. And it must have been too weird for straight adventure magazine since it didn't appear there either. It was also the longest Conan story with the exception of the novel, so that may have also worked against its publication. At the end of the story, Conan sails off to become a pirate again. Kind of hard to lead a revolution in an inland country when you're sailing about the Western Ocean. De Camp came up with a somewhat unique solution. He flat out rewrote the end of the story. Conan used the treasure found in it to fund the revolution, so De Camp also changed the title of it to The Treasure of Tranicos. The original version was finally published in 1987 in the first volume of Echoes of Valor, fulfilling a longtime dream of editor Carl Edward Wagner. The key event regarding its placement is when Conan appears in pirate garb. The others are surprised to see him. His ship was spotted off the coast, shattered against a reef. It sounds like it should be Conan's ship from Pool of the Black One. But now this would mean possibly taking two stories, Black River and Black Stranger, and moving them forward. Or we have to take into consideration that according to the Service of Bit Yakin, Conan was in Shem. A year later, he'd been down south in Kishan and Punt, then worked his way back up north to the western border regions of Aquilonia for Black River. That might have taken 3 years. So let's leave everything in place for now. After 3 times in the frontier, Howard returned to the heart of the Hyborian world with Man-Eaters of Zambula, changed for publication to Shadows of Zambula. What was it with Farnsworth writing all these shadow titles? It definitely takes place after Which Shall Be Born, since Conan has already been a Zuagir chief. Ripke's chronology moves it later in Conan's career after his attempts at building a tribal army in the east. Amra's moves it back next to Witch, but moves both of them before Queen of the Black Coast. Part of their reasoning is to have Conan moving from Zambula to Ophir, then continuing west to his next adventure. Ripke has him joining the army that was destroyed in the Tombaku story, while Amra has him heading to join the war in Argos and the Black Coast. Now, neither quite works for me. A possible explanation is to have Conan traveling to Ophir, getting the reward for the Star of Kerala, then, with his wealth, head back east to take leadership of the Kazaki, the leadership of the Zuagirs having whetted his appetite for such a task. But hang on. Isn't Zuthal of the Dusk before Devil in Iron? Let's get back to this one later as well. The final Conan story Howard wrote, and possibly the last he would ever have written about the character had he lived, is the epic Red Nails. The first part of it appeared in Weird Tales in the July 1936 issue, so it may have just hit the newsstands when he committed suicide. Since it was published after Miller and Clark did their chronology, it shouldn't be considered part of how they created their timeline, but even so, it does fit easily into the slot behind Pool of the Black One and in front of Jewels of Gwalar. However, the existence of the Black Stranger as well as the Wolves Beyond the Border material complicates things more than a little. In Red Nails, Conan tells Valeria the Zangaras brought down his ship before he joined the Free Companions. In The Black Stranger, his ship was sighted off a reefy coast and Conan was the only survivor. Now, are we talking about the same ship, 2 different ships, or even 3 or more ships? Try to follow me, this gets a little tricky. If they're the same ship, placing red nails before Beyond the Black River might still work. But it still leaves Conan sailing away on the Red Hand at the end of Black Stranger. Without the camp's solution, it's awkward but not completely unworkable. Dale Ripke was the first one to propose a solution to the different stories. Namely, they referred to two different ships. The sunken ship referred to in Black Stranger is the Wastrel from Pool of the Black One. Then the Zangarans sink the Red Hand, the one from Black Stranger. Conan comes ashore, possibly has some of the adventures mentioned in Jewels of Waller, then joins Zorallo and the Free Companions for the beginning of Red Nails. In a draft of Red Nails, Conan had destroyed the port town of Valaladad in Zangara, giving them even more of an excuse to take him out. Then the events of Gwalar happened, since in Red Nails he mentioned he'd never been as far south as he is, and supposedly the city of Alkmenen is to the north of Zuktal. Now, Amr came up with a different solution altogether. When I commented on his timeline thinking he'd subscribe to the same ship theory, he said that was not the case. The ships mentioned could be the Wastrel and the Red Hand, could be just one of them, or maybe even neither. Well, it certainly sounds possible. I think it's better to tie together pieces where possible. The ship in Black Stranger sounds like the Wastrel from where the ship went down. When that story was not published, the ship mentioned in Red Nails essentially became the Wastrel, since there was no other pirate ship Conan commanded. Leave aside the ship in Iron Shadows, all of our loose ends can't be tied up. But reading how Howard developed it, it sounds far more like the Red Hand in Red Nails. Plus, there's the line in Wolves Beyond the Border placing Black River and Black Stranger, for that matter, at least 5 years before Conan took the crown. It seems like you could place at least one adventure in there. The progression of Black River, Black Stranger, Red Nails, and then the Aquilonian War works in spacing things out but not leaving too many years empty. This move, however, has to have us look at Jewels of Gwalar. It was certainly written to follow Pool of the Black One, but almost all the stories written after it could fit in there as well. I can't subscribe to Amra's idea of having Conan being mentioned late of the Baraka Isles before he got there in a specific story, so it has to remain after Pool of the Black One. It also has Conan coming out of the south in Vale of Lost Women to becoming a Kashani general in Gwalar. I'm not so sure about this since he has to bring Livia, the girl in that story, north anyway to her home, so it doesn't necessitate his being in that area. I had a discussion with Dale Ripke about possibly moving Gwalar in his timeline back behind Pool, and he laid out a multitude of reasons why it wouldn't work. So what would the possible arc be from the sinking of the Wastrel to the Aquilonian War? We could either have A, the Wastrel sinks, Conan comes ashore in Shem, he ends up in Akbatana, then heads south to Kishon and Alkmenen. He travels to Punt with Muriela, the girl in Gwalar, then heads back to the Aquilonian frontier to scout. After the destruction of Fort Felitrium, he gets captured by the Picts. He escapes and meets Strom and the pirates. He sails away with the Red Hand until it's sunk by the Zangarans. He joins up with Zorallo, then heads south with Valeria. He then returns north to lead the army of Aquilonia. Or we could try B. The Wastrel is sunk. Conan comes ashore and joins the Aquilonian army. After Fort Velitrium, he gets captured by the Picts. He escapes and meets Strom and the pirates. He sails away in the Red Hand until it's sunk by the Zangarans. He joins Zorallo, then travels south with Valeria. He then returns and possibly visits Akbatana here. He then heads to Kishon and Alkmenen, then travels to Punt with Muriela, and after that, heads north to lead the army of Aquilonia. To me, the second seems more likely. So we move Jewels of Gwalar after Red Nails, where it was. Now to deal with Zuthal of the Dusk. For our purposes, it has to be placed after Iron Shadows, but directly after seems unlikely if the rebel princes are the same character. And a placement after Shadows in Zambula, or Man-Eaters of Zambula, take your pick, Has been going back and forth from east to west, north to south a bit too much. But what about a placement after which shall be born? Placing it there would accomplish two things. First, it would give some space between the wars in Koth, allowing time for things to go bad. Second, it also goes along with Ripke's idea that some time has passed between which shall be born and Shadow's man-eaters and Zambula. And third, it allows Conan time to actually go get the reward for Star of Corolla and head back east. Hence, the Kozaki cycle would go something like this. Conan returns from the Black Coast and, needing money, signs on as a mercenary with the free companions who end up joining up with the Kozaki. His army gets slaughtered and he becomes a pirate on the Viliet, then somehow ends up leaving. There's not even a hint of how that happens, so let's just go with it. He becomes captain of the guard in Karan, gets crucified, and later ends up head of the Zhuagars. The situation in Koth goes bad once more, and Prince Almer gets Conan to help him again. The army is destroyed, and Conan takes the trip to Zuthal. After bringing Natala, the girl in Zuthal, back to civilization, he takes the trip to Zambula and finds the Star of Corolla. Bringing it back to Ophir, he gets a reward that he uses to return to the Vilya, and with his fortune becomes the Kozaki leader. So my Conan saga looks something like this. Call it a probable informal chronology of Conan the Cimmerian. Conan is born on a battlefield in Cimmeria during a raid by Vanir warriors. We then go to the Frost Giant's daughter, the God in the Bowl, Tower of the Elephant, the Nestor Synopsis, aka Hall of the Dead, Rogues on the House, the Yarlit Fragment, aka Hand in her Gal, Black Colossus, Queen of the Black Coast, the Shambhala Fragment, aka Snout in the Dark, Iron Shadows in the Moon, A Witch Shall Be Born, Zuthal of the Dusk, Man-Eaters of Zambula, The Devil in Iron, People of the Black Circle, the Tumbalku Fragment, aka Drums of Tumbalku, Veil of Lost Women, Pool of the Black One, Beyond the Black River, The Black Stranger, Red Nails, Service of Bit Yakin, aka Joseph Gwaller, Wolves Beyond the Border, Phoenix on the Sword, The Scarlet Citadel, and Hour of the Dragon. Howard mentions that Conan traveled quite a bit during his time as king, even going to an unnamed continent in the West. Hint, hint. Now, it's been assumed that this was Conan's last story. More than one author has treated it this way. But other than the one sentence in the middle later, Howard gave no indication when or where Conan died. He certainly didn't say that he died in Mexico or whatever the Hyborian age equivalent was. Now, when I got into Conan around the time of the film some 40 years ago, the only way to read these stories was in the Ace paperback series, which I later found out was a reprint of the old Lancer series. These were edited by L. Sprague de Camp, and not only did he edit the original stories for one reason or another, but put in additional stories he and Lynn Carter wrote. They also used some from a Swedish writer, Bjorn Nyberg, I believe. At the time, it worked since there wasn't as much of a creator-centric ethos back then. But in the late 70s, Carl Edward Wagner worked with Berkeley to put out just the Howard stories in their original Weird Tales versions as part of their own Howard series, complete with great Ken Kelly, God rest his soul, covers. 3 volumes came out before de Camp made them stop. Wagner concentrated on the later, longer stories. The 3 volumes were Hour of the Dragon, Red Nails, and People of the Black Circle. He was sort of doing them in reverse publication order somewhat. He probably could have finished up the stories with one more book, but it was not meant to be. These days, the original stories are very easy to find, partially due to them falling into public domain in several parts of the world. In the United States, they were available first from Wandering Star in a set of high-priced hardcovers. Then later, Del Rey put out softcover trade editions of the Conan series, along with many other Howard collections. I wish they would have done one similar to the Howard Foundation Swords of the North, but luckily I got one of those before they went out of print. And in an ironic little twist, all of the de Camp stories and novels are unavailable. Now, they should be available, but kept separate from the Howard stories so they can be judged on their own merits. Some of them are pretty good, some of them, like everything, not all good or bad. But those 3 Del Rey trades are the best and easiest way to read the original stories. There are other collections that have everything in 1 or 2 volumes, but there have been some criticisms about misspellings, things like that. So in my opinion, go with the Del Reys. Now, how do you read them? I'd say at first read them in the order that they have them in the Del Reys, in the order written. After that, you can try your own method. One time I read them in the order they appeared in Weird Tales, but added in the missing stories around the time they should have appeared if Farnsworth took them all, and making sure Howard only had 1 story per issue of Weird Tales. Frost Giant's Daughter would be a February 1933 story. God in the Bowl I put in August 1933 since Howard had poems in April and May. And The Haunting Ghost Western Man on the Ground in July. Veil of Lost Women could have gone in July 1934 since Haunter the Ring is in June. The Black Stranger would go in 3 months between July and October 1935. Take your pick which 3. Now, around the time Howard was trying to come up with Tower of the Elephant, he wrote down a history of this era called the Hyborian Age. In it, he tied together the Conan stories with his earlier creation, Kull. But it wasn't the only example of Howard using a shared history of his creations. Years before Marvel and DC, and independently of what J.R.R. Tolkien was doing in England, Robert E. Howard was creating his own extended universe. We'll take a look at those stories in the new year, but we've also got something special coming up for the holidays. Next time, from the Numenor Chronicles themselves, we start to relate the tale of Conan the Barbarian, from his youth in the north, through his days as a thief, soldier, pirate, and outlaw chief, right through the days when he became king of the mightiest kingdom of the Hyborian Age, Aquilonia. We'll tell the story using the words of its chronicler, Robert E. Howard, plus mention a few of the other tales and legends not contained in the chronicles. It will be broken into 5 parts: Conan the Thief, Conan the Mercenary, Conan the Adventurer, Conan the Warrior, and Conan the King. I hope you enjoy it. Please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm John Harchar. Thanks for listening.